The world, for Lady Elara Vance, had shrunk to the size of a faded tapestry. For 5 years, since the carriage accident that had claimed her parents and her inheritance, she had lived within the suffocating weave of her aunt's ambitions. Her life at number 17, Grosvenor Square, was one of muted colors and whispered commands, a perpetual state of being overlooked. She was the gray thread in her Aunt Beatrice's garish design, necessary to hold the brighter colors together, but intended never to be seen. The brighter colors were, of course, her cousin, Isolde. With hair the color of spun gold and eyes the shade of a summer sky, Isolde was the family's singular asset, the masterpiece Beatrice intended to sell to the highest bidder on the London marriage market. Elara, with her quiet demeanor, her sensible brown hair, and her eyes the color of moss after a rain, was deemed scenery. She was plain, her aunt had declared once, with the casual cruelty that was her custom. Not homely, precisely, but utterly, unforgivably unremarkable. And so she had been hidden, not locked in an attic, for Beatrice was a creature of propriety above all else, but hidden in plain sight. Dressed in drab grays and browns, her hair styled to conceal rather than flatter, she was Isolde's shadow, her chaperone, her unpaid lady's maid. She fetched the shawls, held the fans, and faded into the floral wallpaper at every social gathering. Her existence was a rhythm of quiet duties. She managed the household accounts with a precision that kept her aunt's profligate spending from tipping into outright ruin. A skill Beatrice both relied upon and resented. She read to Isolde from French novels, her accent perfect, while her cousin's was execrable. She arranged the flowers, her artistic touch giving life to the stuffy rooms, though the credit was always absorbed by the house itself, as if the blooms had simply willed themselves into elegance. She endured Beatrice's constant, biting critiques. Her posture was poor, her silence was morose, her presence was a drain on the family's strained resources. Elara had learned to build a fortress within herself. Behind her placid expression, she lived a vibrant internal life. She traveled the world through the books in her late father's small, neglected collection. She debated philosophy with authors long dead. She was sent to the modiste with fabric swatches, to the bootmaker with Isolde's slippers, to the florist with intricate instructions. "You, of course, will need something to wear," Beatrice had said one afternoon, not looking up from her inspection of a bolt of silk the color of a robin's egg. The tone implied it was a tiresome afterthought. "Find something in the cedar chest. One of Isolde's old gowns should suffice. The pale yellow one, perhaps. It will wash you out dreadfully, but it cannot be helped." Elara did not argue. She knew her role. She was to attend as Isolde's chaperone, a necessary piece of social architecture to ensure her cousin's reputation remained pristine. Her purpose was to be a duenna, a silent sentry. Her drabness was, in fact, an asset. It would only make Isolde shine brighter. The night of the ball arrived, draped in the velvet dark of a London spring. A fine mist slicked the cobblestones, making the gaslights swim with hazy halos. Inside, the house was a flurry of nervous energy. Isolde was a vision in her robin's egg silk, diamonds glittering at her throat. Beatrice, in plum satin, looked like a hawk surveying her hunting ground. Elara stood before the mirror in her own room, regarding the pale yellow gown. As her aunt had predicted, it drained the color from her face, making her look wan and spectral. The gown, made for Isolde's more voluptuous figure 2 seasons ago, hung loosely on Elara's slender frame. Her loyal maid, Annalise, a girl her own age, with kind eyes and a fierce sense of justice, had done her best, pinning and tucking, but it was a hopeless cause. "It's not right, my lady," Annalise whispered, her brow furrowed. "She does it on purpose, to make you invisible." Elara offered a small, sad smile in the reflection. "To be invisible is to be safe, Annalise. There is a certain freedom in it." But as she descended the stairs to join her aunt and cousin, a knot of something that felt dangerously like despair tightened in her chest. For one night, just one, she wished not to be invisible. She wished to be seen. the Ainsworth Ballroom, a play for which she had never been given a script. Her eyes drifted, cataloguing the room's occupants, the ambitious mothers, the bored husbands, the hopeful daughters. And then she saw him, the Marquess of Blackwood, Alistair. Even a recluse like Ilara knew of him. He was a legend, a ghost story whispered over teacups. He possessed one of the oldest titles and largest fortunes in England, but he was a man wrapped in shadow. They said he was cruel, that his heart was a shard of ice. They said his vast estate in the north, Blackwood Manor, was a place of sorrow, haunted by the tragic death of his first wife years ago. He had a child, a daughter, whom no one ever saw. He appeared in London only when absolutely necessary, a dark, saturnine figure who moved through the glittering ballrooms of the Ton like a thundercloud. He stood near the French doors that led to the terrace, alone. He was taller than most men in the room, with hair as black as a raven's wing and a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite. He was not handsome in the way the pretty young dandies were. His was a stark, severe beauty, all sharp angles and forbidding lines. He held a glass of brandy, but he did not drink from it. His dark eyes swept the room with an unnerving intensity, a look of profound, weary boredom. He dismissed everyone he saw, the hopeful debutantes, the scheming mothers, even the dazzling Isolde, with an almost imperceptible curl of his lip. Ilara found she could not look away. He was a creature of stark contrasts in this room of frivolous pastels. He was a piece of the wild, untamed Northlands dropped into a gilded cage. He represented a world away from this suffocating performance, a world of harsh truths and deep, quiet sorrows. She felt a strange, inexplicable kinship with his isolation. He was alone by choice and power. She was alone by circumstance and neglect. Yet they were both, in that moment, islands. As if he could feel the weight of her stare, his head turned. His dark eyes, which had swept over so many, suddenly stopped. They landed on her, standing half hidden by a potted palm. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She felt a hot began to move, not toward the dance floor, not toward the terrace, but directly, purposefully, toward her. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. He couldn't be. It was a mistake. He must be heading for someone standing behind her. She risked a glance over her shoulder, but there was only the damask wallpaper. He stopped before her. He was even taller up close, a formidable presence that seemed to absorb the candlelight around him. The air grew still. People nearby began to notice, their chatter faltering. A Marquess did not approach a wallflower. "Lady Ilara Vance," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and dark, like the brandy in his glass. It was not a question. She was so stunned that he knew her name, that she could only manage a faint, breathless, "My lord." "You are not dancing," he stated, his eyes missing nothing, not her ill-fitting gown, not her nervous hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. I am content to watch, Lord Blackwood." A corner of his mouth tilted, a fractional movement that was not quite a smile. "A waste of good music." He extended a gloved hand. "Dance with me." It was an order, not an invitation. A ripple of shock spread through the onlookers. Ilara could feel her aunt's horrified gaze burning into her back from across the room. This was not part of the plan. This was a disruption of the highest order. She, the grey thread, was being pulled from the tapestry, threatening to unravel the entire design. "My lord, she began, searching for an excuse. "I will not ask again," he said, his voice quiet, but laced with an unmistakable thread of steel. Her mind raced. To refuse a Marquess so publicly would be a catastrophic scandal. To accept would invite her aunt's incandescent fury. But in his dark, unyielding eyes, she saw an escape, however brief. A single dance, where she was not invisible. Trembling, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm through the layers of their gloves. He led her onto the dance floor just as the orchestra began a new waltz. The other couples seemed to melt away, giving them a wide berth. The whispers followed them like the rustle of dry leaves. He pulled her into the formal hold of the waltz. A predator's grace, utterly in control. All she could do was follow. She was acutely aware of every eye in the room on them, on her. For the first time in her life, she was the center of attention, and it was terrifying. She felt exposed, a moth pinned to a board. Why was he doing this? Was it some cruel joke, a way to mock the desperate machinations of the marriage market? Finally, she dared to lift her eyes to his. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, intense. The granite mask was still in place, but his eyes held a strange, searching quality. The music swelled, the violins soaring to a crescendo. He spun her in a final, graceful turn as the music came to its end. But he did not release her. He held her there, in the center of the silent, staring room. And then he spoke, his voice low, but carrying with perfect clarity in the sudden hush. "Lady Ilara," he said, his gaze unwavering, "you will marry me." The world tilted on its axis. A collective gasp swept the ballroom. Ilara stared at him, certain she had misheard. It was not a proposal, it was a pronouncement. The decree delivered as if he were a king and she his subject. I beg your pardon," she stammered, her mind a maelstrom of confusion. "There is no need," he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. "My solicitor will call upon your aunt in the morning to discuss the terms. We will be married by special license before the end of the week." He released her then, gave a curt, formal bow, and turned on his heel. He walked from the dance floor, through the parted sea of gawking aristocrats, and out of the ballroom without a backward glance, leaving Ilara standing alone in the wreckage of her invisibility. The journey back to Grosvenor Square was a masterclass in silent fury. Beatrice sat ramrod straight, her face a thunderous mask, while Isolde wept noisily into a lace handkerchief, her perfect evening ruined. Ilara sat opposite them, numb, the Marquess's impossible words echoing in her ears. "You will marry me." It had felt less like a proposal and more like a sentencing. The moment the carriage door was closed behind them, the storm broke. "How dare you?" Beatrice hissed, her aunt's eyes. She was guilty of the one crime Beatrice could never forgive, stealing the spotlight. She escaped to her room, her head pounding, her body trembling with delayed shock. Annalise helped her out of the hated yellow gown, her face a mixture of awe and concern. "He asked for you, my lady," Annalise breathed. "The Marquess himself, in front of everyone." "He did not ask," Ilara corrected, sinking onto the edge of her bed. "He commanded." She felt a chill seep into her bones. This was not a fairy tale. The dark, forbidding Marquess had not been enchanted by a hidden princess. He had chosen a tool, a piece for a game she did not understand. The next morning, as promised, the Marquess's solicitor arrived. He was a small, dry man, with papers that crackled like fire. Ilara was summoned to the drawing room, where her aunt, her rage now cooled into a calculating avarice, presided. The terms were laid out with brutal clarity. Lord Blackwood wished to marry Lady Ilara Vance. In return for her hand, he would settle the entirety of the late Baron Vance's debts, which, the solicitor noted with a pointed look, were considerable. He would also provide a generous quarterly allowance for Beatrice and a handsome dowry for Isolde, ensuring her own advantageous match. The marriage contract was already drawn. It was a transaction, pure and simple. Her, in exchange for her family's solvency. "And what does his lordship require of my niece in this arrangement?" Beatrice asked, her voice dripping with false concern. The solicitor adjusted his spectacles. "The Marquess requires a wife, a marchioness, to serve as mistress of his household, and as a mother to his daughter, Lady Clara. He expects discretion, dignity, and compliance. It is to be, in all respects, a marriage of convenience. His lordship's personal life is to remain his own." The meaning was clear. He was buying a housekeeper and a governess with a title. He wanted a wife who would be as unobtrusive as a piece of furniture, who would not make demands on his time or his heart. He had surveyed the ballroom and, in his cold calculus, had chosen the most invisible, most pliable woman he could find. Marchioness of Blackwood. She would be mistress of her own home. She would be free of her aunt. It was not the illusion of freedom, perhaps, but it was a change of scenery. And in the vast, cold expanse of Blackwood Manor, there might be a corner, a forgotten room or a walled garden, where she could finally be left alone. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting the solicitor's. "I accept the Marquess's terms," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And so it was settled. Lady Ilara Vance, the grey thread, the hidden niece, was to be sold. But as she signed the papers, a tiny, defiant spark ignited within her. They thought they were buying a meek, compliant girl. They did not know about the fortress she had built inside herself, or the strength it took to survive in the shadows. She was leaving one cage, and perhaps, just perhaps, she would find a way to unlock the door of the next. The wedding was a hurried, sterile affair, conducted by special license in a dusty London chapel. There were no flowers, no guests, only the necessary witnesses. Her aunt, looking smug, Isolde, looking sullen, and Lord Blackwood's solicitor. Her groom stood beside her, a forbidding statue in black wool. He spoke his vows in a low, dispassionate monotone, his words echoing in the empty space. When he slid the heavy gold ring onto her finger, his touch was cold, impersonal, like the brush of stone. There was no kiss. The journey north began immediately after. A heavy, oppressive silence filled the carriage, a silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves and the creak of the leather suspension. Ilara sat opposite her new husband, the Marquess of Blackwood, and studied the stark landscape of his face. He stared out the window, his jaw tight, his expression closed and unyielding. He had not spoken a single personal word to her since his pronouncement in the ballroom. He was a stranger, and she was now his wife, his property. She felt a tremor of fear. What had she done? She had traded a known misery for an unknown terror. This man was not merely cold. He was a void, a place where warmth and emotion seemed to go to die. She tried to quell the rising panic by focus but siege. Its mullioned windows were like vacant eyes staring out over the desolate landscape. A flock of rooks circled one of the turrets, their harsh cries the only sound besides the wind and the rain. The carriage rolled to a stop before a massive oak door studded with iron. The door swung open, and a line of servants stood waiting in the grand, echoing entrance hall. They were as silent and severe as the house itself, their faces impassive. At their head was a tall, rail-thin woman in a black bombazine dress with a formidable set of keys hanging from her waist. Her grey hair was scraped back into a tight, unforgiving bun. The Marquess finally spoke, his voice seeming to chill the already cold air. "Mrs. Gable, this is your new mistress, the Marchioness of Blackwood." The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, dipped into a curtsy so stiff it looked painful. "My lady," she said, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. Her eyes, the colour of slate, raked over Ilara, a quick, dismissive appraisal that took in her simple travelling dress and found it wanting. In that single glance, Ilara understood that her new title meant nothing here. She was an outsider, an interloper. "Show her to her rooms," the Marquess commanded, already shrugging out of his greatcoat. "I have business in my study." He did not look at Ilara. He turned and strode down a long, dark corridor, his footsteps echoing on the stone flags, and disappeared behind a heavy door, abandoning her without a second glance. "If you will follow me, my lady," Mrs. Gable said, her tone making it clear that Ilara had no choice in the matter. She was led up a grand, sweeping staircase of dark, polished wood. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors with cold, watchful eyes followed her ascent. The air in the house was still and frigid, carrying the faint, musty scent of old stone, beeswax, and something else, something like sorrow. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Her apartments were in the east wing. They were vast and opulent, furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture and rich, faded brocades. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but its flames seemed to offer no warmth, their light swallowed by the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. It was a beautiful prison. Had another question, one that had been nagging at her since the solicitor's pronouncement. My husband, the Marquess, mentioned a child, a daughter. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into a severe line. Lady Clara keeps to the nursery wing. She is a quiet child. She takes her meals there. You will not be troubled by her. Troubled by her? The phrasing was cold, dismissive, as if a child were an inconvenience to be managed. But deep, instinctual ache bloomed in Ilara's chest. After the housekeeper departed, leaving Ilara in the echoing silence of her new rooms, Annalise helped her unpack, her cheerful chatter a small, defiant flame against the oppressive gloom. But even Annalise's spirits seemed to dampen in the face of the manor's cold majesty. Over the next few days, Ilara began to explore her new domain. She discovered that Blackwood Manor was a labyrinth of corridors, drawing rooms, and libraries, most of them shrouded in dust sheets, monuments to a life that was no longer lived there. The silence was the most pervasive feature. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, disturbed only by the ticking of unseen clocks and the sighing of the wind in the chimneys. Her husband remained a ghost. She saw him only at dinner, an excruciatingly tense affair, held in a baronial dining hall so vast they had to raise their voices to be heard across the polished expanse of the table. He would ask her a few perfunctory questions about the household, receive her clipped, formal answers, and then retreat back into his impenetrable silence. He ate quickly, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, and would excuse himself to his study the moment the meal was concluded. She learned nothing of him, except that his presence was like a perpetual winter. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for air, she ventured outside. The rain had ceased, but the sky remained a uniform, pearlescent grey. The grounds were as wild and untamed as the surrounding moors, the lawns overgrown, the paths disappearing into thickets of weeds. As she rounded the side of the house, she came upon a high stone wall, nearly hidden by a cascade of ancient, thorny ivy. In the wall was a heavy iron gate, chained and padlocked. Curious, floors of the main house, she found the locked wing. It was at the end of a long, dusty corridor, a single door at the end, heavier and more ornate than the others. When she tried the handle, she found it locked fast. There was a strange finality to it, a sense of deliberate exclusion. Mrs. Gable appeared as if from nowhere, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the runner. "This wing is not in use, my lady," she said, her voice sharp. "His lordship's orders." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty corridor, the locked wing, the dead garden, the silent child. They were all pieces of a puzzle, a history of sorrow that everyone in this house was forbidden to speak of. She was the mistress of this place, but she was a stranger to its secrets. She was a queen with no subjects and no kingdom, only a set of cold, beautiful rooms and a silence that screamed. The weeks bled into one another, each day a perfect, monotonous copy of the last. The grey sky, the silent meals, the endless, echoing corridors. Ilara felt a familiar despair begin to creep in, the same sense of being slowly erased that she had felt in her aunt's house. But this time something was different. Here, there was no Beatrice to watch her, to criticize her, to actively suppress her. Her husband's neglect, as cold as it was, afforded her a strange kind of freedom. He did not care what she did, as long as she remained quiet and invisible. And so she refused to wither. She had survived her aunt. She would survive the Marquess of Blackwood. Her rebellion began not with a grand gesture, but with a small, quiet act of defiance. She would not be a ghost in this house of ghosts. She began by learning the servants' names, speaking to them with a kindness that seemed to startle them. She complimented the cook on a particularly well-made broth and was met with a flush of surprised pleasure. She asked a young housemaid about her family in the village. Slowly, cautiously, the staff began to thaw, their impassive masks occasionally slipping to reveal the human beings beneath. They still answered to Mrs. Gable, but they began to look at Ilara with a glimmer of warmth, of loyalty. Her next objective was the garden. The image of its desolation had haunted her. It was a wound. A hardy, climbing rose still showed green on its stems, The structure was still there, the ghost of a magnificent garden. It would be her project, her sanctuary, a place where she could cultivate life in the midst of all this stillness. She enlisted the help of a young undergardener named Tom, a lad with a sunburnt face and hands as calloused as old leather. He was wary at first, mumbling about his lordship's orders, but her quiet determination and the offer of extra pay from her own pin money eventually won him over. They started with the thorns, cutting back the dead wood, clearing the tangled briars that choked the paths. It was hard, physical work. Her hands, accustomed only to needlepoint and the turning of pages, became scratched and sore. Her muscles ached, but she welcomed the pain. It was a clean, honest ache, a feeling of accomplishment that was entirely her own. As she worked, clearing the decay, she felt as if she were clearing the cobwebs from her own soul. Her other project was Clara. She had yet to see the child, who remained sequestered in the nursery wing like a fairy tale princess locked in a tower. Ilara began by simply walking past the corridor that led to the nursery each day. She never tried the door. She just wanted her presence to become a familiar, non-threatening part of the household's geography. Then, she began to leave small gifts on the floor outside the nursery door. Nothing grand. A perfect, pearly white feather she found on the moor. A smooth grey stone from the riverbed, which she painted with a tiny, cheerful ladybug. A single, brave snowdrop from the reclaimed garden, left in a tiny vase of water. She never waited for a response. She would leave the object and walk away. It was a silent conversation, an offering with no expectation of return. For weeks, nothing happened. The objects would disappear, taken in by the child's nurse, no doubt, but there was no acknowledgement. Ilara persisted. It was an act of faith. One afternoon, as she was kneeling in the garden, carefully tying a newly cleared rose cane to the wall, she heard a tiny sound. She looked up and saw a small face peering at her. A slow, wide smile spreading across her face. It was progress. She decided to be bolder. The next sunny afternoon, she took a book and a blanket to a patch of lawn that was visible from the nursery window. She did not look up at the window. She simply sat and read aloud, her voice soft and even, reciting a simple tale about a brave field mouse. She did this for 3 days. On the 4th day, as she was reading, she saw a flicker of movement. The nursery door at the far end of the lawn had opened. Clara was standing on the threshold, half hidden behind the door, watching her. Ilara's voice did not waver. She pretended not to notice, continuing with her story. After a few minutes, Clara took a hesitant step out onto the grass. Then another. She crept closer, silent as a fawn, and sat down on the very edge of the blanket, her small body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest sudden movement. Ilara finished the chapter and gently closed the book. She did not look at the child. She simply sat, sharing the quiet afternoon with her. After a long silence, a tiny voice, thin and reedy from disuse, whispered a single word. "More?" Ilara's heart felt as if it would burst. She opened the book and began to read again, her own voice thick with unshed tears. The progress with the garden and the child did not go unnoticed. Her husband, the Marquess, was a man of routines. Every afternoon at 4, he would stand at the window of his study, which overlooked the walled garden, and drink a cup of tea. Ilara had learned this from the household staff. She was always aware of his unseen presence as she worked below. At first, she had been unnerved by it, but now she simply ignored it. The garden was her world. He was merely a spectator. She had begun to bring Clara into the garden with her. The child was still mostly silent, but she would follow Ilara around, her huge eyes taking everything in. She would touch the soft new leaves on the rose bushes, her expression one of wonder. Ilara gave her a small trowel and showed her how to plant pansy seeds in a little patch of her own. The child's focus was absolute. her small hands gentle with the fragile seedlings. One afternoon, a ladybug landed on Clara's arm, witnessed a miracle. Their eyes met across the distance, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze other than cold indifference. It was a complex, turbulent mix of emotions she could not name: pain, regret, and something that looked terrifyingly like hope. He broke the contact first, stepping back from the window and disappearing into the shadows of his study. That evening, dinner began with the usual oppressive silence. Ilara expected it to continue that way, but after the soup course was cleared, the Marquess spoke, his voice startling her. "The garden," he said, not looking at her. "I see you have been active." "I find the work rewarding, my lord," she replied, her heart beating a little faster. He was silent for a moment, turning his wine glass by the stem. "Mrs. Gable informs me you are paying the boy, Tom, from your own allowance. He is a good worker. He deserves it." Another silence. Then, "See that you submit any expenditures for your project to my steward. He will see they are paid from the estate accounts." He finally lifted his eyes to hers. "It is a large undertaking. Do not bankrupt yourself on my account." And then he returned to his meal. But the words hung in the air between them. It was not praise. It was not an expression of gratitude. But it was an acknowledgement, a concession. It was the first crack in the wall of ice he had built around himself, a tiny, almost imperceptible glimmer of light, promising that somewhere, deep beneath the frozen surface, something might still be alive. The fragile peace of Blackwood Manor, a peace Ilara had so painstakingly cultivated, was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing her aunt's florid seal. Beatrice and Isolde were coming for a visit. The letter was full of effusive, false sentiment about how they simply ached to see how their dearest Ilara was faring in her new life. Ilara knew the truth. They were coming to inspect her cage, to assess the full extent of her husband's wealth, and, no doubt, for Beatrice to search for some new angle to exploit. She informed the Marquess at dinner, steeling herself for his reaction. He read the letter, his expression unreadable, and handed it back to her. "They are your family," he said, watching servants. "Oh, you poor thing. This house. It is rather grim, isn't it? But we shall bring a bit of London sunshine to these dreary halls." The visit was an exercise in torment. Beatrice found fault with everything, her criticisms always phrased as sympathetic observations. The draperies were so heavy, the food so plain, the silence so very oppressive. She treated Ilara with a cloying condescension that set her teeth on edge, constantly referring to her astonishing luck in landing such a prestigious, if emotionally unavailable, husband. Her true target, however, was Alistair. She deployed all her charms, attempting to flatter and engage him, while strategically positioning Isolde in his path at every opportunity. Isolde, following her mother's script, would attempt to draw him into conversation, her voice bright and flirtatious, a sound as out of place in Blackwood Manor as a canary in a crypt. Alistair was a master of polite, glacial dismissal. He treated their presence as a mild inconvenience, like a persistent draft. He would answer their questions with curt monosyllables and excuse himself at the earliest possible opportunity. His coldness only seemed to spur Beatrice on, as if melting him were a challenge she was determined to win. Ilara felt herself shrinking back into the invisible girl from Grosvenor Square. Her aunt's presence was a constant, draining reminder of her past, undermining the small measure of confidence she had built. She retreated to the garden, her only sanctuary, but even there she was not safe. "My dear, you must not neglect your appearance," Beatrice said, finding her one afternoon, her fashionable slippers looking absurd on the gravel path. "All this digging in the dirt. It is most unbecoming for a marchioness. You will ruin your hands. What must your husband think?" She glanced around at the budding roses with a look of disdain. "And really, all this effort for a patch of weeds." The worst of it was their effect on Clara. The child, who had been slowly, tentatively emerging from her shell, retreated completely. The loud voices, The bright colors, the intrusive presence of the strangers sent her scurrying back to the safety of the nursery. Beatrice tried to dote on her, call smile on her lips. But it takes a certain maternal warmth, does it not? A softness. Some are blessed with it. She gestured vaguely at Isolde. And some, well, they are more suited to other, more practical pursuits. She finished with a pointed look at Ilara's hands, which were still slightly calloused from her work in the garden. The insult was breathtaking in its precision. A dart aimed at Ilara's deepest insecurities. It implied she was cold, barren, and unfeminine, all while painting Isolde as the paragon of fertile womanhood. But the true cruelty was in the way she dismissed Ilara's connection with Clara. The most precious thing Ilara had managed to build in this desolate place. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She stared down at her plate, her throat tight, a familiar wave of shame and helplessness washing over her. She waited for the silence to pass, for the subject to change, for the moment to be over. But the silence was broken by an unexpected voice. "On the contrary," Alistair said, his tone as cold and sharp as breaking ice. He had set down his fork and was looking directly at Beatrice, his dark eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "I find my wife's pursuits to be entirely admirable. She has brought more life to this house in 2 months than it has seen in 6 years." The table fell silent. Even the servants froze, their movements arrested. Alistair never spoke this way, never offered a personal opinion, never engaged. He continued, his gaze unwavering. "As for her maternal warmth, you are clearly mistaken. My daughter has blossomed under her care. Lady Blackwood's suitability as a mother, a wife, and a marchioness is my concern, and mine alone. And I find it to be beyond reproach." He picked up his fork and resumed eating as if nothing had happened. But the words, delivered in his chillingly quiet voice, had the force of a thunderclap. It was a declaration, a defense. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing himself firmly on her side. He had called her Lady Blackwood, my wife, and he had defended her, not just as a signatory to a contract, but as a person. Beatrice's face was a mask of stunned fury. Isolde looked as if she'd been slapped. Night's confrontation. A new awareness existed between her and Alistair. The wall of ice had not melted, but a significant crack had appeared in it, and neither of them knew how to navigate the new terrain. Dinner that evening was a quiet, almost shy affair. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a tentative, uncertain one. They both seemed to be waiting for the other to speak, to acknowledge what had happened. After the meal, Alistair did not immediately retreat to his study as was his custom. He hesitated in the doorway of the dining hall. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a command, but a quiet request. Stunned, Ilara nodded and followed him. He led her not to the drawing room, but out onto the stone terrace at the back of the manor. A storm was brewing in the distance. The sky was a dramatic swirl of dark purple and bruised grey clouds, and the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. It whipped strands of hair across her face and billowed the fabric of her skirt. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the approaching storm. The raw, elemental power of the scene seemed to mirror the turmoil she felt inside. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice small against the rising wind, "for what you said to my aunt." He did not look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his hands gripping the stone balustrade. His knuckles were white. "She was wrong," he said, his voice rough. "What you have done for Clara, I had thought it was impossible." The wind howled, a mournful, lonely sound. A flash of lightning illuminated the distant hills, followed a few seconds later by a low, guttural rumble of thunder. At the sound, Alistair flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his entire body. His face, stark and pale in the gloaming, was a mask of sudden, sharp agony. "This weather," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It was a night like this." Ilara looked at him, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. She knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that this storm was stirring more than just the trees. It was stirring the ghosts of Blackwood Manor. He seemed to be lost in a memory, his eyes unfocused, haunted. The wind, the rain beat candelabra. She could see that his face was ashen, his composure completely shattered. He looked broken. She approached him slowly, cautiously, as one would approach a wounded animal. She did not speak. She simply stood beside him, a quiet, steady presence in the face of his overwhelming pain. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were voids of despair. The mask was gone. The cold, impenetrable Marquess was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a grief so profound it stole her breath. "This is where she died," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a single, tarnished, silver key. His hand was trembling so violently he could barely fit it into the lock. With a click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent corridor, he turned the key. He pushed the heavy door open, revealing a cavern of darkness and dust. He took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped inside. He looked back at her, his eyes pleading, an unspoken invitation. Taking a fortifying breath of her own, Ilara stepped across the threshold, out of the present and into the heart of his past. The air inside was stale and thick with the scent of dust and potpourri that had long since surrendered its fragrance. Everything was draped in white dust sheets, the shrouded furniture like a congregation of silent, sorrowful ghosts. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, revealing its former grandeur. A lady's sitting room, with a delicate writing desk, a chaise longue, and a large, ornate harp, all sleeping under their white veils. At the far end of the room, French doors led out onto a small stone balcony. Alistair walked to the center of the room, his footsteps leaving dark prints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. "Her name was Liana," he said, his voice hollow. "She was like sunshine. She filled this house with music and laughter. Everyone loved her." He gestured to the shrouded harp. She would play for hours. He paused, swallowing hard against a grief that was clearly still raw, still suffocating. "I did not know how to love something so bright," he confessed, his voice dropping to a painful whisper. "I was raised to be this, cold, controlled, responsible for the title, the lands, the family name. I showed my listening." He stared out at the storm-tossed darkness. She loved the garden. It was her creation, her sanctuary. This room, this balcony overlooked it. He turned back to face Ilara, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "The night she died, there was a storm, just like this one. We had argued. I had been cold, dismissive of her sorrow. I told her I had important estate matters to attend to. I left her here and went to my study. I buried myself in ledgers and maps because they were easier to understand than my own wife's heart." A tear finally escaped, tracing a path through the dust of his memory on his cheek. There was a crash of thunder, the worst of the night, and then a scream. It was Clara. She was only a toddler. Her room was next to this one. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if to block out the image. "I ran in here. The balcony doors were open, the wind and rain pouring in. The curtains were whipping in the wind. Liana was gone. I looked over the balcony, and she was down there, in her garden, on the flagstones. Broken." Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No one knows for certain," he continued, his voice choked. "The coroner said she must have slipped on the wet stone. A tragic accident. But I know. I will always believe that I drove her to it. That my coldness, my inability to reach her, finally pushed her over the edge. That she stepped off that balcony to escape me." He finally broke, a harsh, ragged sob tearing from his throat. "My daughter, Clara. She saw it from her window. She saw her mother lying in the rain. She has not spoken more than a handful of words since that night. I did that. I silenced my own child." He sank onto a dust-sheeted chair, his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his grief.
So I locked it all away. I locked up these rooms. I let her garden die. I thought if I could erase every trace of her, I could erase the pain, the guilt. I built a fortress of ice around my heart, and I locked my daughter in there with me.
That. She simply knelt before him on the dusty floor. She reached out, her hand trembling, and gently took his. His skin was cold, his fingers limp in hers. He did not pull away. She just held his hand, her small, warm grasp a silent anchor in his maelstrom of pain. She knelt there in the dark, dusty room, amidst the ghosts of his past, and shared the weight of his sorrow. The storm raged outside, but inside the locked wing, for the first time in 6 years, a profound and absolute stillness descended. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of shared understanding, of a quiet presence that asked for nothing, but offered everything. He clung to her hand as if it were a lifeline. After a long time, his ragged sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He slowly raised his head, his face ravaged by grief, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his gaze she saw not the formidable Marquess, but a man stripped bare of all his titles, all his wealth, all his defenses. He was just Alistair, a man who was lost and hurting, and so desperately alone. "You are still here," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "I am still here," she confirmed softly. The space between them was charged, filled with years of unspoken pain and a fragile, dawning hope. The contract that had defined their relationship, the cold, practical terms laid out by a solicitor, had been rendered meaningless. It had been washed away by the storm, by his tears, by her quiet compassion. He raised his free hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching her cheek. His touch was tentative, reverent, as if he were touching something precious he did not deserve. A jolt, warm and electric, shot through her. It was the first time he had ever touched her with anything approaching tenderness. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why do you not run from this house of sorrow?" "Perhaps," she said, her own voice trembling slightly, "because I know what it is to live in the shadows. I am not afraid of the dark." A profound change occurred in his expression. The agony began to recede, offering comfort, acceptance, and a solace he had long since given up on ever finding. It was a kiss that sealed not a contract, but a connection, a fragile, tentative, and utterly terrifyingly real connection. In the dusty, forgotten room, surrounded by the ghosts of what was, something new and fragile was born. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. The thunder softened to a distant rumble, and the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof gentled to a soft patter. A profound stillness settled over the house, a stillness of peace, not of absence. The days that followed were transformative. It was as if the storm had washed the world clean. The oppressive weight that had hung over Blackwood Manor for 6 years had lifted, leaving behind a clear, quiet atmosphere of possibility. The door to the west wing was left unlocked. The dust sheets remained for now, but the act itself was a monumental shift. A secret had been shared, a wound exposed to the light, and the healing could finally begin. Alistair was a changed man. The granite mask was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability that was more compelling than his former power had ever been. The silence between them was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a comfortable space of shared understanding. They began to talk, really talk. He asked her about her life before him, about her parents, her love of books. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. In turn, she learned more about him. She learned of his lonely childhood, his demanding father, the immense pressure of his title. She saw the sensitive, intelligent man who had been buried for so long beneath layers of duty and grief. He began to join her in the garden. He did not work, but he would sit on the now-repaired marble bench, watching her as she tended the roses, which were now covered in fat, promising buds. He would read the newspaper, or simply sit, his presence no longer that of a remote observer, but of a quiet companion. Most importantly, he began to rebuild his relationship with Clara. At first, it was awkward. He was a stranger to his own daughter. But Ilara was there to act as a bridge. The three of them would spend afternoons in the garden together. Alistair would watch as Ilara showed a warmth that felt like a promise. The garden was a riot of life. The roses had burst into bloom, a profusion of crimson, pink and white, their scent perfuming the air. The pansies Clara had planted were bright, cheerful faces in the soil. The sound of bees humming filled the air. It was a place resurrected, a testament to patience and care. Ilara was pruning a climbing rose on the garden wall when Alistair came to stand beside her. Clara was a short distance away, her laughter now a frequent and beautiful sound, ringing out as she chased a cabbage-white butterfly across the lawn. "It is beautiful," Alistair said, his voice quiet with awe. He was not looking at the roses, he was looking at her. "You have performed a miracle here, Ilara." "I only cleared away what was choking the life out of it," she replied, snipping a dead branch. "The roots were always strong." He was silent for a moment, his gaze full of a meaning that made her heart beat faster. "You were not just talking about the garden, were you?" She met his eyes, a blush rising on her cheeks. "No," she admitted softly. He reached out and took the shears from her hand, setting them on the bench. He took her hands, calloused and smudged with dirt, in his own. He turned them over and gently, reverently, kissed her palms. "When I asked you to marry me," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I was a desperate, selfish man. I was looking for a solution, a convenience. I saw in you a quiet strength, a self-sufficiency that I hoped would not make demands upon my empty heart. I wanted someone to manage my house, not to share my life. It was the most dishonorable proposal a man could make." He looked up from her hands, his dark eyes searching her face. "I was wrong. About everything. I thought I needed a marchioness to run my home. But what I needed, what this house and my daughter and my own withered soul needed, was you. Your kindness, your patience, your unwavering, gentle light that was not afraid of my darkness." His grip on her hands tightened. "You did not just bring my garden back to life, Ilara. You brought me back to life. You gave me back my daughter. You have shown me that the heart is not a fortress to be defended, but a garden to be tended. And I—" Tears finally spilling over and tracing paths down her cheeks. A slow, radiant smile transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows, making him look younger, freer than she had ever seen him. "I love you, Alistair," she whispered, finding her voice at last. "I think I have, from the very beginning." He pulled her into his arms, his embrace no longer hesitant or grateful, but full of a deep, possessive and joyful love. He kissed her, not in a dusty room full of ghosts, but here, in the sunshine, surrounded by the life they had cultivated together. It was a kiss that held the promise of 1,000 more. A kiss that sealed not just a partnership, but a future. From across the lawn, they heard the sound of Clara's happy laughter, the perfect, hopeful music for the first day of their real life. 1 year later, Blackwood Manor was unrecognizable. Sunshine streamed through clean windows, illuminating rooms that were filled with flowers from the now famous gardens. The dust sheets were gone, stored away with the grief they had once represented. The sound of laughter often echoed in the corridors, and the West Wing had been reopened, its rooms redecorated in light, cheerful colors. Liana's harp had been restored, and a music teacher now came from the village twice a week for Clara. The heart of the house was the garden. It was a masterpiece, a testament to a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of soils. People came from all over the county to see the Blackwood roses, and Ilara, the once invisible girl, was now a celebrated hostess, known for her grace, her quiet intelligence, and the startling beauty of her creation. But her greatest creation was her family. Clara was a bright, talkative, and happy 7-year-old. Her past trauma a distant shadow, healed by the steady, unconditional love of the two people she called Mama and Papa. Alistair was no longer the forbidding spectre of London society. He had found a peace and contentment that had softened the harsh lines of his face. He doted on his wife and daughter, his love for them evident in every look, every touch. He was still a man of quiet temperament, but his silence was now one of peaceful contemplation, not of pained withdrawal. He had even developed a dry, surprising wit that he reserved exclusively. Kiss to her temple. You took a cursed, haunted place and turned it into paradise. He looked around at the blooming roses, at the sun-dappled lawn, at the house that was now a home. You are my paradise, Elara. She lifted her head and met his gaze, her heart full. The journey had been long and arduous, a slow, patient battle against the thorns of grief and neglect. But here, in this place of life and beauty, she knew she had found where she was always meant to be. She was no longer the grey thread, the hidden niece, the convenient wife. She was Elara, Marchioness of Blackwood, a gardener of hearts, a healer of wounds, and a beloved wife. She had been seen, and in being seen, she had found her true self. Dear listener, the story of Elara and Alastair is more than just a tale of a grand house and a troubled lord. It is a quiet testament to a profound and often overlooked truth, that the most powerful force for change in the world is not a grand gesture, but patient, persistent, and compassionate attention. How many of us have encountered a locked garden in our own lives? It might be a person we love, who has closed themselves off due to pain or loss. It could be a part of our own hearts that we have neglected, a dream we allowed to become overgrown with the weeds of fear and practicality. It might even be a community or a situation that seems so broken, so desolate, that we believe it is beyond repair. Elara's magic was not in a sweeping, dramatic act. It was in the small, consistent, and faithful things. She did not demand that the garden bloom overnight. She simply started by pulling one weed. She did not demand that the silent child speak. She simply left a painted stone by the door. She did not demand that her husband's heart be opened. She simply sat with him in his darkness and held his hand. In our fast-paced world, we are often taught to look for quick fixes and dramatic transformations. We want the overnight success, the instant connection, the immediate healing. But real, lasting growth, like that of a garden, requires time. It requires showing up, day after day, especially when there is no visible progress. It requires the courage to tend to the thorns, to believe in the strength of the roots hidden beneath the surface, and to have faith that sunshine and care will eventually sunrise of earned intimacy and trust. It is the love that says, I am not afraid of your broken places. I will stay. I will help you tend the soil until you are ready to bloom again. May you have the courage to pick up your trowel and tend to the neglected gardens in your world. And may you have the grace to recognize and cherish the patient gardener who comes to tend to yours. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. It helps our garden of stories continue to grow.